the question of a political language is something that is very personal to me, because very often I get called all kinds of names by which I don't recognize myself. So that occasionally I get called far right, sometimes I get called far left, I mean, and in between a lot of more abusive sort of concepts. And I decided at some point in my life, I don't know when, that one of my jobs is to really delve into the question of language, because obviously language controls so much of the way that we think. But also, unless we get our idea of language right, we just lack the clarity about what is taking place within society. And over the years, particularly the last 3-4 years, I've been looking at words and the use of words, both by people that I agree with, and particularly those people that I oppose. And in my mind, I'm trying to continually deconstruct, what are they really saying? Because so often the words they use sounds a little bit hollow. It's almost like a word that they kind of picked out from a different era and are using in a way that doesn't make very much sense. It's a bit like when you talk to people who are not English, when they first begin to use English words, there's something strained and something psychically distant from the real meaning of that. They're using words that they don't quite understand, and that's understandable when you're an immigrant. But when you're a political philosopher or when you're a politician, then you know there's a problem here. So I've been looking at different words, and there's a danger that I will get lost in our vocabulary. It's very easy to get lost because it's difficult to nail down these kind of issues. And I've decided that I begin my journey into this project that I'm involved in by looking at the term alienation. I go into the question of alienation in more detail in a Substack that I published today. But it's only one dimension of that. Now, alienation refers to the sense of estrangement or separation from others, from both your community and from the world of things. It's a kind of distance, a psychic distance, that has been part of the human condition for some time. And in a world where an alienated sensibility prevails, there is little that can take hold and bind individuals to a common shared reality. I mean, throughout this talk, the word common will reoccur time and time again, because it's the capacity of having a common shared reality that is so important and is so much missing in our public discourse, where very often you talk to people whose reality is so utterly different that they cannot really comprehend what you're saying. They just don't understand why you say, how could you say that, is the reaction I often get in discussion and debates. Now, throughout most of Western history, and especially since modern times, alienation, the sense of estrangement, was imposed as a condition that should be challenged, and it shouldn't be one to which people should simply resign. And one of the things about the world today is that alienation has become normalized. It's become part of the new normal, or at least personalized from a psychological standpoint. It's a condition that fatalistically we got to live with. And sometimes it's not even treated as a problem for society. I mean, in many respects, estrangement and the feeling of separation from others are often regarded by particularly our cultural elites as a symptom of a lack of flexibility and a reluctance to adapt to new ways. So when you feel that somehow you're estranged from your community, it no longer resembles what it used to look like, then you get criticized for being close-minded and not seeing the way that the new world kind of works. And so when people feel that they have become strangers in their own land, they often feel that this is not a feeling that they should actually voice. It's something that they're a bit embarrassed about. It's something that you censor yourself. And this was a point that the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, temporarily forgot when he gave his Island of Strangers speech. Somehow, I don't know what happened to him. He wasn't aware of the fact that he shouldn't be saying that. Maybe it's the fault of his speechwriters. But however, he very quickly changed his mind. He realized before too long that this was a speech that he shouldn't give. And he actually said, listen to the words that he uses. He says, I wouldn't have used those words if I had known they were, or even would be, interpreted as an echo of Powell, that's Enoch Powell, and his famous speech that you mostly will heard about. I had no idea, and my speechwriters didn't know either. I mean, talk about babyish naivety. But that particular phrase, no, it wasn't right. I'll give you the honest truth. I deeply regret using it. And so basically, what you have is a sense of, oh my God, am I giving the game away by using the word stranger? And then he says, and this wasn't reported in the newspapers, but in the interview he says, there were problems with the language in his foreword to the policy document that said record high numbers of immigrants entering to the UK under the last government had done incalculable damage to the country. Right. So basically he says, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. It's actually true, but that's not something that you kind of communicate in good company. And here you have a situation where even the Prime Minister of the country has to watch his words. And basically, the way that I interpret this event is that what he's really saying, but he doesn't really know it, nor does the press and the media, is that there is no longer a word in the English language for expressing the love of one's country, right? You can no longer say in good company that you love your country, because that seems really, really, really old-fashioned, outdated, something that is really, really wrong with that. So just as you can no longer use the word strangers because of its kind of negative connotations, you can no longer talk about a love you feel for your community or your country or for people that you kind of grew up with. And judging by the critical reactions that Starmer's speech provoked amongst what's called the left, amongst the media, amongst the cultural elites, you could draw the conclusion, and you'd be entitled to draw that conclusion, that there are no strangers in the United Kingdom. They don't exist. And this was the point that a Labour MP, Olivia Blake, told Parliament. She says, does the Secretary of State agree with me that far from being strangers, migrants are our neighbors, friends and family, an integral part and members of our communities, and that moves to cast them as strangers are both divisive and hostile and risk legitimizing the same far-right violence we saw in last year's summer's riots. So in other words, the argument is it doesn't matter what the truth is, right? It doesn't matter that many people feel that not everybody is not a stranger, not everybody is the opposite of a stranger. We cannot use the word stranger or see people as stranger because of the fact that it would help provoke riots and legitimize the points of view of the people that are concerned about mass migration. And basically, those people who highlight the contrast between a stranger and compatriot, and by the way, the word compatriot also does no longer exist, become the target of suspicion or become demonized. So, if we don't have a word for love of one's country, what do we call those few people who bravely talk about their love for their own country? What's the words that we use to express that? Well, the words that we use in our media and in our education system is jingoism. Somebody who loves their country is jingoistic. Chauvinism, loyalism, isolationism, partisanship, flag waving, and tribalist. I very carefully looked at all the different ways in which this term is kind of reacted. And all these terms that are used express not love, but hate. That's really what they really get at. It basically assumes that your love for your community ipso facto represents hatred for people who are not your compatriots. So it seems to me that what we have is a situation where what people are really saying is that love and identification and the feeling of solidarity, which happens when you feel you're part of a community, is somehow suspicious, and instead the state of alienation and estrangement becomes by implicitly the norm, something that you actually justify as social scientists do these days by saying that we live in an era of fluid modernity. It's defined by incessant change. And because we live in a fast-changing world, why should sameness and identity be preferred, to use their words, over otherness and difference? And basically what you're saying is that the idea that there could be a community or a homogeneous community is something that we should treat with suspicion, because by definition they signify exclusion of some form, restriction. So basically, in our world that we live in, the politicization of identity, which we discussed many, many times in the past, is trumped by this kind of sense of fluid indeterminacy. And fluid indeterminacy, which is seen as a characteristic that we should aspire to, comes across as being the dominant values. You know, you're flexible, you're able to sort of move with the times. And that, in a sense, trumps its opposite, where you're basically rooted, where you basically have a commitment to a certain relation, where you take the idea of duty to the people that are around you seriously. That's particularly seen as being really, really bad. So therefore, what we have is that we have a very weakening sense of of alienation and estrangement. And in our cultural climate, that is regarded more or less as something that we need to live with, to the point at which even the idea of a home or a homeland is seen as being an overrated or potentially negative sort of sensibility. And one of the things that is interesting here, certainly for me, having looked at political discourse for a long time, is that the discourse on alienation has shifted. And historically, the people that were concerned with alienation were on the left. You will know famously Marx's theory of alienation as being quite central to this discussion. You will know that in general, alienation is something that the left fought against and saw as being critically important. I think today what has happened is that the idea of alienation, which used to be a left-wing target of concern, has now moved to the right, particularly the populist right, if you want to use those terms. And indeed, the only people in the Western world who take the problem of alienation seriously is the national populists, who are continually concerned and are the only ones that actually talk about the home or the ideology of a homeland. And I find that really quite fascinating. And I was very delighted that I came across an article written by a man called Martin Jay, a historian from California, a professor there, who in his writing on the history of alienation makes precisely this point, but unlike me, sees that as a very positive development. And he basically points it like, he argues this, he says, in short, alienation in the second decade of the 21st century has not actually faded away as a descriptor of human distress. Rather, it has become most visible in the anxiety of those who bemoan the transformation of a beloved homeland into an unrecognizable nation of aliens. And the way he uses, just listen to him, beloved homeland, right, is almost to make fun of the idea that you could love your homeland, and that you could almost feel the sense of sarcasm that he has, because there are people who love their homeland, and these are the people for whom alienation is still something that is really quite important. So basically, I think that the changing role, I mean, there's many ways that the left and right have shifted their position, and I use the term left and right only because I haven't got a better word for them, because they're not actually anything like the historical left or the historical right. But I think the shift is most strikingly demonstrated in the sensibility they express towards the experience of alienation, towards uprootedness and disconnection and separation, all the elements which are involved in the whole alienated kind of existence. And therefore, the quest for a home and the fear of homelessness is typically dismissed as constituting a refusal to face up to the consequences of a rapidly changing society. As the American Catholic theologian Rusty Reno noted, some say that homelessness is an intrinsic feature of modernity, while others contend that homelessness and disquietude are the inevitable price of technological progress and free markets. But I think that what he's really trying to get at is that when you have a fatalistic tendency to normalize homelessness and alienation from space and reconcile people to their condition of deracination, when you have that kind of situation, then something really fundamentally important has changed. And you cannot understand the visible manifestation of this, which is that when you look around Europe, who does the working class vote for? The working class doesn't vote for the left or people that call themselves left or the socialists. They vote for the populist right. In Italy, in Holland, in Germany, France, old communist territories are now represented by organizations like the Rassemblement National. You cannot understand why this happens, why you have this political shift, unless you understand this cultural shift that has occurred between the left and the right in the way that homelessness is understood. That is why in the literature, in the academic literature, critics of populists dismiss it on the ground that it represents the ideology of home. I mean, time and time again, they say, oh, look at these guys. They promote an ideology of the homeland. And for them, they don't just simply say ideology of home. They justify that by saying that this is because it's an illusion. There is no homeland. The homeland is an illusory phenomenon which represents, in their words, nostalgia for a reconstructed past, and in turn provides a sense of security against a perceived loss of identity. So the way they express this is that there are all these weak, feeble individuals who feel really insecure because they feel uprooted from their homeland. And because they feel so insecure, they invent this nostalgic past in order to kind of find a degree of comfort rather than face up to the grim reality of the technological era that kind of we live in. So basically, what we have is a situation where alienation becomes normalized, and acquiescence to homelessness becomes really acceptable. So what do we have? Well, what we have, first of all, is the pathologization of nostalgia. And these days, the word nostalgia always has negative connotations. Even I became imprisoned in that nostalgia. Only fools are nostalgic. But what is nostalgia in the way that they describe it? Nostalgia actually, at its bottom line, represents an aspiration to maintain a degree of cultural connection. It basically means that you somehow want to remain connected to what the previous generations, your ancestors, accomplished. You want to be connected to a legacy which is imprinted within your own community. And that aspiration for connection is then dismissed as nostalgia. And what you have as a result of that is basically the undermining of this kind of stability and rootedness that human beings need as they search for a home. The thing that I became aware of in the course of looking at this, and at first I couldn't understand why is it? Why is it that they always say that populists, or populist ideology or populist outlook is underpinned by what they call an ideology of common sense. And time again, the word common sense is used in a negative way to dismiss what populism is really all about. Now, what's wrong with common sense? Right? I mean, call me old-fashioned, but common sense used to mean that there are certain things you can take for granted in your everyday life. It's the taking for granted dimension. And in fact, as Immanuel Kant and Hume and Aristotle, all these great philosophers explained, common sense is the one sense that binds together our 5 other different senses. And common sense is something that, for that reason, is logically prior to science, but that science couldn't really come about and develop without the intuitive accomplishment that common sense provides. Common sense provides those kind of experiences on which science is based. And then I thought of it a little bit more. Why is it that at my old age, I'm attracted to the idea of common sense? Is it because, like a lot of old people, I lose imagination, I become inflexible and really boring, and therefore you reach out to common sense? Or is there something about common sense that is really, really important? And what is really important about common sense is the common aspect of it, is the common aspect. Because what common sense refers to, what it's based upon, are experiences and ideals about what we have in common. The reason why it's common sense is because it's built upon the experiences of a community, about what has happened over the centuries, about what people have learned. It is not unlike what Machiavelli famously called the wisdom of the masses. And it's an important element upon which our intellectual life is actually built. But the reason why common sense is particularly hated by its critics is because it draws attention to the primacy, the centrality of community, of commonness, right? Which is the opposite of diversity, right? It's the opposite of the differentiated process that they all like when they talk about difference. And in a sense, it seems to me that when we're talking about common sense, we're talking about the foundation of a shared reality and the primacy of a shared reality. It basically represents a kind of bandedness, a moral and intellectual bandedness that serves as a glue that binds people together. And one of the reasons why it is particularly despised in our times is because it represents the moral contrast, the moral opposite to the idealization of inclusion. Because in a sense, there are different types of common senses. Different groups have different kind of common sense. And that's the way that it works. According to the hegemonic cultural script prevailing in Western society, the various forms of special relations, unique attachments, solidarities, emotional connections are not particularly liked because they can never be inclusive. Right? When you are emotionally attached to somebody, when you love somebody, for example, you exclude a lot of people unless you have the trans idea of what love is all about, where you can love everybody from a monkey to a cat and nothing, much, and all the rest in between. So it seems to me that common sense and the ideas that kind of come out of it is the very opposite of the commanding values of inclusion, diversity, difference, and heterogeneity. And in particular, those people that identify with a nation or national community or a particular community are by definitions are saying that we are discriminating against those who aren't. And given the fact that discrimination is also a word that has a new meaning, and it's a word that we should interrogate very closely, you have to remember that there was a time when to discriminate was seen as a positive accomplishment. When she's a discriminating person, was seen as a really positive person who doesn't just simply, say yes to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. Right? Today, discrimination is seen as being horrible, negative, to the point at which, if you look at our laws in the UK, if, for example, at work on Friday night, a bunch of mates go out for a drink, and they forget to invite Jacob, or maybe intentionally they forget to invite Jacob, right? Then Jacob is being discriminated against, and there are laws, bullying laws, which basically protect Jacob. So just imagine that, okay, we're going out for a drink with the mates, but we also have got to invite Jacob. So what does that really mean? So what I'm really trying to get at is that these kind of words have a very important kind of consequences to them. And therefore, all the things that involve overcoming alienation or being bounded or being rooted, separated, are ones that, by definition, involve discrimination. So what I'm really getting at is when you look at the way that we're kind of talking about things that are very important for us, we're gradually becoming dispossessed of our language, or certainly a language that can capture reality in an adequate kind of a way. It means that what we have is a loss of voice, where literally millions of people are expected to use words that are foreign to them. And we know that that's the case because every organization, every institution gives you a language guide of words that you should use in a very helpful kind of way. They remind you, you might want to use the word elderly instead of old. And they kind of kindly tell you what words you should use in different kind of circumstances. And it seems to me that when you lose your voice, when you cannot even use the words that are natural to you, then powerlessness and alienation acquires an intensity that is very different than existed in the past. When Marx talked about alienation, he talked about people being alienated from their work, right? That they're being exploited in the wage labor capital relationship. But it was a very clear, focused discussion of alienation. When Hegel talks about alienation, Hegel talks about the inability of developing self kind of consciousness. When Durkheim talks about anime, his version of that, it's got a very clear, very specific meaning. Whereas today, when we experience alienation and we talk about it, it's not focused on any one thing, because when you come home from being alienated in your workplace, there is no home to come to. And not only there's no home to come to, but there isn't a language that is rooted in the experience of that community. You cannot even, and this is really an important point, you cannot even talk in accordance with a sensibility that is common to you and those of others. You cannot take for granted that the words you use will be understood and reciprocated by other kinds of people. And therefore what you have is a situation where powerlessness and alienation acquires a very distinct a new form. Hence, I think what we have, and this is what this discussion is really all about, and what we're trying to do here, is recognize the need for a new language. And the language that we need to evolve and develop in the first instance has got to be based on the rehabilitation of common sense, where common sense becomes the point of departure, not the end, the point of departure of the words and the language that we actually use. 20 years ago, in 2005, I wrote a book called The Politics of Fear. Maybe one or two you have seen it, at least the cover of it, if not the content of that. And in this book, The Politics of Fear, I argued that we live in pre-political times. And because we live in pre-political times, we got to let go of the categories that helped to illuminate political life during the last century. I remember at the time, many people laughed at me. You know, Frank, Furedi is such an idiot. How could we live in pre-political times when there's all these politics going on? Not really recognizing what I was referring to, which was that all the important debates and disputes and conflicts that were really important in our lives touched upon the pre-political sphere. All the really important questions had to do with family, relationships, identity, the sense of nation. All the important discussions were not about, you know, sort of the tax regime in the United States, but they were much more fundamental than that. And not only did they touch upon the pre-political sphere, they were taking place through a use of language where the categories were more or less emptied of meaning. And what I argued in that book was that the political right has given up on the past, and the left has given up on the future, and that in a sense we had to reestablish a claim on both. Because it's only by mobilizing the past achievements of humanity that we can begin to influence the future. That's the real challenge for us, to be able to, in a sense, both not conserve anything in the present, because in the present, in the public sphere, there isn't very much useful to conserve, but to conserve a particular legacy to do with, let's say, Western civilization, but in such a way that we're using and developing that to influence the future. And today, 20 years later, I would argue that the greatest danger that we face is the project that's in the air of disrupting the pre-political fabric of communities that nurtured solidarity and human agency. And that is why, when you look around, there seems to be such an inexorable campaign against a homogeneous pre-political community, how much that's hated. And we can only do that in the first instance if we are able to find our voice and develop a new language. So basically, the point I want to leave with is that what we have got to do, if we're going to be able to contribute to the evolution of a new language, is to begin by building on common sense. We got to get common sense understood in a much more sophisticated way than we're doing. That we basically are able to connect with the aspiration for voice, that solidarity and cultural continuity become something that we take seriously, that homeland and home is a quest that we take part in and actively promote. And most important of all, I think there is an important way that we can resonate with the world in this project by emphasizing the need for control. You know, one of the interesting things that I learned in the course of writing my book is how much there is a demand for control on the part of people who are estranged, uprooted, and feel that there is nothing that they can claim, or there's little that they can claim as their own. And as I was trying to make sense of this, I came across an essay written by somebody who tried to explain why it was that during the Brexit referendum, the motto, take control, was seen as being so important. Let's take control. And apparently, and this was kind of acknowledged by Dominic Cummings and others, they basically came up with the slogan because in the focus groups that they were doing in the campaign for Brexit, by talking to a lot of people, time and time again, the people that wanted to do something about their lives used the word control use the need for control as being a central aspiration that they expressed. So what's interesting here is that unlike most political slogans, which are invented by public relations people, this one came out of the mouth of the public, of people finally expressing this aspiration for taking control. And that is something that is looked down upon and continue to look down upon. But in a sense, this is a very positive development that we can build on, because in many ways, people are without our help or without any kind of assistance, are trying to find their own voice and trying to find their own way of expressing exactly what it is that they want from the world and how they want to build the future. And our job, in a sense, is to do whatever we can to encourage those people, give them the confidence to find their voice, because the minute they begin to know that they can find their voice, then public life in our world will begin to change for the better. Thank you.